Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Mon français n'est pas aussi bon que Sylvia. Quand vous posez votre question, s'il vous plaît, parlez très lentement. All right. So, welcome to my talk. Ultrasound is one of the most commonly used medical imaging modalities. Oh, I forgot to thank QBIN for inviting me to this talk. It's a great honor to be selected as one of the rising stars, so this will push me to work even harder. So ultrasound is one of the most commonly used medical imaging modalities because it's real-time, it's inexpensive, it's safe, and it's portable. For a long time, big ultrasound manufacturers have been basically closely guarding the raw data in ultrasound, and that's perhaps because they were too powerful and they could say no to all requests to share raw data. But this raw data, in fact, has most of the information. So here in the left, I'm showing some, see actually if I can, there you go. So here in the left, we see the raw pre-beamformed channel RF data, which is visually not informative, and therefore is converted to the familiar B-mode scan that we see in the right. But most of the information in the raw data is lost in this conversion, and in fact, we can think of the B-mode image as the tip of the iceberg. So another underutilized feature of ultrasound is that it has very high frame rate. So it can allow us to look at basically mechanics of the tissue during deformation. So here in the left, I'm showing a video of a phantom being deformed. And here we are basically, so you can think of this, my cell phone, as an ultrasound probe. So we are basically deforming the phantom with the ultrasound probe. So you can see the motions are large. And in the right, you have to pay very close attention to see the motion because here we are using acoustic radiation force in the lab. So ultrasound can be focused. And when ultrasound is focused, it has the power to actually move the tissue. So here we are moving the phantom with acoustic radiation force. And again, from the pattern of this motion, we can infer biomechanical properties of the tissue. So another area where AI can improve ultrasound is in aiding collection and interpretation of ultrasound data. So in this image, you can see Dr. Bouali. He's a radiologist at the MUHC. He's collecting data from Concordia athletes at the Perform Center. And he's an expert in anatomy. He's an expert in ultrasound physics. And he uses all of his expertise to know where to place the probe and what should be the orientation of the probe, right? So the probe has 6 degrees of freedom, and it's very hard to know where to put it and what orientation to put it. And even after you collect a nice quality ultrasound image, it's hard to interpret that image. So here, find the cursor again. So here, we see an ultrasound scan of the brain. So if you show this ultrasound scan even to an experienced neurologist or neurosurgeon, he or she will find it difficult to interpret. But if you register it to an MRI scan and show them side by side or overlaid, as you see here, then it will be much easier to basically interpret these ultrasound scans. So here it's a patient who had brain cancer and the tumor is resected in the ultrasound image. So this was collected during surgery at the MNI in Louis' lab. So basically in this work, for example, we showed that it is possible to register this ultrasound to pre-surgical MRI, and then potentially this registration can be used to find that, oh, there is a residual tumor here that needs to be resected. So based on that, my talk has 2 fronts. The first front is on better use of raw data to get more out of ultrasound. And the second front is on aiding collection and interpretation of ultrasound images. And both of them will be with the help of AI. So first, I will talk about ultrasound elastography. So in ultrasound elastography, it has many forms, but one of the simplest forms, you simply place the probe on the tissue. You start basically compressing the tissue with the probe. and you get like a movie of the tissue as it's being deformed. So schematically here we see like the probe compressing a tissue. And for example, we can take two of those images and then calculate the deformation map between those images, and then calculate the derivative of that, which gives us a strain. Now here, when some tissue is hard, its compression is going to be smaller compared to the soft tissue. So here we see that this tissue is hard, it doesn't compress as much as these parts of the tissue. And it's very useful because tissue pathology is usually correlated with its stiffness. For example, cancers are usually found by feeling like a hard lump. And we can see that this basically hard inclusion is barely visible in the original images. So arguably the most challenging step of ultrasound elastography is estimating this deformation map. So again, in the left, I'm showing the deformation map when it's large, and we are using the probe to compress the tissue. And in the right, the deformations are small because we are using acoustic radiation force to basically deform the tissue. So what we do to solve this problem is we formulate it as an optimization problem where we have data fidelity and regularization terms. This is a very complex cost function. It's highly nonlinear, and it has many variables. It has a couple of million variables. So in my lab, we have developed very efficient optimization techniques to basically solve this optimization problem. And these codes are available online. So in fact, almost all of the codes that I talk about are available at this website, code.sonography.ai. So in my lab, we were the first to propose to use deep learning to estimate this displacement map because it's a very difficult task to calculate it using deep learning. So what we essentially did in this work is that since there's no ground truth in real images, right? So in deep learning, we always want training data. And in real images, there's no training data because we don't know the ground truth deformation. So we used simulated data to train the network. But the issue is that there's a large domain shift when you're using simulation data to train because simulation is not real ultrasound. It's much more simplistic. And also, even if you can, design very careful experiments where you can track these displacements, one of the cool properties of ultrasound is that it's very flexible. So it has many knobs that you can turn and, based on your organ that you're imaging. So it's practically impossible to train under all of those different imaging settings. So basically the point is that there's lots of ultrasound data, but we don't have the ground truth of those images. We don't really know what is the ground truth deformation in those images. So to see actually what we did, let's first talk about semi-supervised learning. So in supervised learning, in a rosy world where we have lots of labeled training data, we can draw a nice decision boundary between the two classes. But here we have a few labeled data. And we see that if we only use those labeled training data, the decision boundary that we draw is not as nice as if we had many more training data. So in semi-supervised learning, basically what we do is that we leverage those unlabeled data to draw basically the optimal decision boundary between your classes. So what we did in this work, which was published in MICAI 2 years ago, is we fine-tuned the network on real data using cycle consistency. So basically saying that the deformation between image 1 to image 2 should be the inverse of the deformation between image 2 to image 1. And this year, we propose to incorporate physical priors into our loss function. So in elastography, it's well known that estimation of lateral strain is extremely difficult for several reasons. So we use basically this law that lateral strain is equal to minus Poisson's ratio times axial strain. But this law is only correct for homogeneous material without any boundary conditions, which is almost never satisfied. So in real world, where we have inhomogeneous material with boundary conditions, The effective Poisson's ratio is used instead. It's defined the same way, but it's called effective Poisson's ratio. And to show basically what is effective Poisson's ratio, here I'm showing a finite element simulation. So here we have simulated this thing using Abacus. This is our axial and lateral deformations, and these are all axial and lateral strains. Now, this was my ground truth Poisson's ratio. If I simply basically divide these two images by each other, as you can see in this definition for effective Poisson's ratio, I will get this image. So we clearly see, even though the Poisson's ratio is, uniform here and here, the effective Poisson's ratio that I get even in the simulated data is not the same as the actual Poisson's ratio. And here you see the difference. But the idea is that the range of the effective Poisson's ratio is in the same range. It's between 0.2 and 0.5, which is the range that is physically known to be the range for the Poisson's ratio. So we basically, we use this prior to train our neural network to basically estimate better lateral strains. And I'm happy to say that this paper was accepted even without going through the rebuttal in MICAI this year. So these are some of our results. So here you see the B mode image. Here you see overwind, another method that uses optimization. Here's an unsupervised training technique. And here's our proposed method, picture physically inspired constraints. And you can see that basically this lesion is much better visible in our method compared to the unsupervised method, which is another deep learning based method. So moving on to quantitative ultrasound. So ultrasound is a fascinating imaging modality. Basically, it interacts with tissue in many, many different ways. So you can think of these circles as resolution cells, sort of like a point spread function of our ultrasound imaging system. We can have a few scatterers here, or we can have many scatterers, or we can have a mixture. And here, for example, you see we have a strong reflector here. So this can be, for example, the boundary between two tissues. So the goal of quantitative ultrasound is to use the raw data to infer statistical properties of the scattering medium. So here the image in the left is basically a bunch of scatterers distributed in a medium, and dark represents few scatterers and bright represents many scatterers, right? So here we have many scatterers, here we have few. The ultrasound image of this scattering medium can look something like this. So if you pay very close attention, you can see the same features in the two images. So this is the forward problem, going from the scattering medium to the ultrasound image, which is usually a much easier problem. And going from the inverse problem to basically finding these scatterers is the inverse problem, which is usually ill-posed. So what we did in this work is that we used quantitative ultrasound to basically find properties of these phantoms, which were very carefully constructed in the lab. So, for example, this phantom has 3 layers, which have known attenuation, known backscattering, so known quantitative properties. And we showed that we can estimate those properties using with quantitative ultrasound methods. And this work is in collaboration with UW-Madison. So here is another phantom. So here, this phantom also has 3 layers, but we don't really see the layers at all in the B mode image. We see sort of as a uniform phantom, but that's not the case. This is a phantom made with 3 different layers with 3 different properties. So again, this shows that B mode image only shows the tip of the iceberg. And to solve these quantitative ultrasound properties, we have proposed both optimization-based methods, where we have a data term and a physics-based regularization term, which we optimize using ADMM, and also deep learning-based, where we basically feed this image to a CNN. We also get statistical properties of that and feed it to an MLP, and then we fuse them together to estimate the statistical properties. So now let's move on to faster ultrasound acquisition. So in ultrasound, we can focus the beam during transmission, which will give us excellent resolution at the focal point. But the resolution is not so good elsewhere. So for example, here we can't distinguish these two targets. So the solution to that is to send multiple waves focused at multiple locations and then fuse those images together. Okay. Unfortunately, a drawback of this method is that it basically reduces the temporal resolution and also is susceptible to motion blur. So if the tissue has moved between these scans, then it results in blurring. So we wanted to see whether we can use GANs where we give one of the focus imaging to the generator and it generates a nice image focused everywhere. So a brief intro into GANs. GANs consist of two networks, the generator and the discriminator. So the generator tries to generate realistic looking images and the discriminator tries to distinguish between real and fake images. So you can think of these as like a police, so this discriminator, and a criminal who is trying to forge, let's say, dollar bills. Right? So when this network is fully trained, the discriminator cannot distinguish between fake and real data anymore. That means that the generator becomes so good that its generated images look as real images. Right? So in this work, we basically first have an ultrasound image focused at this location. So the blue triangle shows the location of the focal point. And we see that since the focus is here, the image quality is quite poor up there, right? So like this window shows the zoomed in version of this window up there. And we see that we don't see a good basically cyst up here. And the image at the right is an image where we had 3 transmissions. And you can see that the image quality is good everywhere. So basically our goal was to design a GAN where we give it this image as the input, and the GAN generates an image that looks similar to this image. So here in these results, blue again means the actual physical focal point that was generated, and green arrow means the simulated focus that was generated at that location. And we use different CNN super resolution techniques to generate these images. We see that the performance is not very good. And we propose 2 GANs to do that, a regular GAN and a boundary sticking GAN, and we see that they work much better. Of course, these are simulations, so we move to real data as well. So again, this is an image collected from a real phantom. So here we see that the focal point is here, and because of that, the quality of the image is quite poor up there at basically this cyst. So this is the blown up version. And this is the 3 transmissions, so we transmitted 3 times, and this is sort of like the ground truth image. Again, the CNN super resolution methods and our GAN methods, and again, we see that the boundary seeking GAN generates the best result. So we see that, yes, actually, we can actually generate good images with GAN. All right, so now let's move on to aberration correction for transcranial imaging and focusing. So in ultrasound, we assume a nominal speed of sound to be able to focus at basically any point. So our nominal speed of sound is C1. So when we assume that nominal speed of sound, we see that basically the wave focuses here. But often in real tissue, we have some layer in between that has very different speed of sound. So for example, you can think of C2 as the skull, right? So the skull can be quite thin here and can be quite thick here. So when the wave wants to propagate here, we see that the wave from the lower path gets here sooner because C2 is much higher. In the bone, the speed of sound is much higher. And therefore, the image quality will be quite poor. And that's one of the main reasons that transcranial ultrasound is not really done that much because of this aberration. So this is a work that was done by my PhD student, co-supervised with Habib. So in this work, he simulated different aberration profiles. So here we see a weak aberration, the red basically curve, and a strong aberration, the blue curve. We see that when we have the weak aberration, we lose part of contrast, and when we have strong aberration, we almost completely lose the contrast. And again, we propose to use CNNs to basically solve this inverse problem of going from a strong aberrated image to the basically high quality non-aberrated image. And he's working on much cooler versions of this. So this has many applications in transcranial imaging, obviously for low intensity focus ultrasound for modulating brain function, and also in high intensity focus ultrasound for drug delivery or ablation. So let's move to the next part, which is deep beamforming. So as I said earlier in my talk, this basically pre-beamformed channel data is not visually informative. We have to convert it to this ultrasound image. And it's not very easy to do this conversion, right? So normally what is done is basically basically ultrasound consists of many piezoelectric crystals here. We get like a channel data from each one of them. We apply some time delays that accounts for the time difference between different paths to different crystals. And then we apply some apodization window to basically average these up, right? And then we get the RF data, and from RF data, we calculate the ultrasound image, right? So this is not data-driven at all. So no matter what the data is, we apply the same basically delay and some beamforming. So we wanted to see whether we can develop a data-driven approach with deep learning. So the issues of doing that is that in fact, the issues are quite similar to elastography. Again, we don't have real training data from real images because we don't know in real images how the image looks like. Right? So we have scarcity of training data, lack of ground truth, and a domain shift if we want to use simulation to train the network. So instead, what we did in this work is that we applied minimum variance beamforming. So minimum variance beamforming is a computational technique that has closed form solution. The reason it's not used in practice is that it's computationally very, very expensive. But that's okay for us because we only want to do that once for generating the training database. So we can train on each pixel separately, so we will have lots of training data, even from one image. And of course, the advantage is that now we are training directly on the real data, right? So there's no domain shift. And our method actually, which was developed by my PhD student, Gudarzi, worked actually quite well. We ranked, when he sent his code to the challenge, our method ranked first in terms of image quality. So here it's one basically example that's shown in this summary paper of the challenge that was published. So again, if I can find my cursor. So this is an in vivo image. This is from one plane wave, and we see that the quality of the image is quite poor. This is the image that ranked first with us, so it tied with us in rank 1. And we see that its quality is not as good as the method that my student developed. But the reason that we were tied was that his network was much, much faster than our network. And in the right, we see sort of like the ground truth image. So this was generated with 75 plane waves. So of course, we can't always do this. And also it basically generating an image with 75 plane waves really reduces the frame rate by a factor of 75. But we see that our network, which had never seen this type of data, works quite well on these basically real images. And so these are two different data sets, and we see that in both of them it's quite close to the image generated from 75 plane waves. So now let's talk about some clinical applications of the work that we have done. So breast cancer-related lymphedema is caused by localized fluid retention and tissue swelling caused by a compromised lymphatic system. It's most frequently a complication of cancer treatment, and it's a debilitating condition. Some patients refer to it as being worse than the cancer itself. And currently, pitting test is normally done, but unfortunately, it's very subjective, and ultrasound cannot be used to accurately stage lymphedema. So in this work, in collaboration with McGill University Health Center, we basically imaged patients. So we looked at both arms, affected and unaffected arms, at different locations, and we showed that both elastography and deep learning can be used to help clinicians stage lymphedema. Right. So this is another example of using ultrasound and elastography for tendon and ligament imaging. So again, this is Dr. Bouali imaging an athlete at the Perform Center, and I think this one's me imaging a PhD student. Basically our hypothesis here was that if the tendon is intact, then basically the strain in the tendon is relatively uniform. But if it has a microscopic tear that cannot be seen in ultrasound, so this tear can be extremely small, that's completely invisible. When we subject this to some force, we will have stress concentration because this tear cannot bear any force. So we see that we can actually measure these strains. This is patellar tendon in the knee. So here the subject is trying to flex his knee. And we see that we generate, reasonable strain maps here. And here is the rotator cuff tendon, RCT. And again, the subject was trying to flex his shoulder. And here we see basically these deformations in the tendon. All right. So now we move on to the second part of my talk, which is aiding collection and interpretation of images. These are basically the things that I learned during my postdoc at Louis' lab. And since he's giving a talk later today, and he's a much better speaker than me, I will basically leave this part for a later day in the interest of time. So I'd like to wrap up my talk by highlighting that I think ultrasound has a very bright future. So this is one of the early ultrasound probes. It was so heavy that it had to be mechanically held by a mechanical arm. Right? And current ultrasound probes are so light that we can, hold them in hand. Of course, we don't need these, mechanical arms anymore. And here is my PhD student imaging himself with a Clarius ultrasound probe, which is portable and is battery operated, and it simply shows the image on his smartphone. Right? So the idea is that doctors can carry these with them in their pocket, like stethoscopes. And because of that, we often see interesting breakthroughs in ultrasound on major news outlets. So I'd like to thank my students. I have many amazing students. I'm lucky to have them, and also the sources of funding. I also have many collaborators at Concordia, which made this work possible, at McGill, at Wisconsin-Madison, UDM, Nuance Microsoft, Think Surgical, Syntef, Clarius, and Johns Hopkins. Thank you.